What's up, y'all? It's me, Emma, the heavy metal lawyer, and today I'm here to talk to you about possibly the greatest year in death metal history, 1991. If you enjoy learning about the history of metal, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, or if you want a roundup of this year's best metal releases, because soon I'll be starting my countdown of the top 50 metal albums of 2021. But today isn't about 2021, it's about 1991. It is hard for the younger metalheads among us to conceive of being a metalhead in 1991. Today, the main problem with each year's metal releases is oversaturation, particularly over the last 5 years or so, as every 90s death metal band has gotten back together to release reunion or comeback albums, in addition to all the modern death metal bands, the expansion of death metal internationally, and the recent wave of old-school death metal nostalgia from bands like Phrenolith and 200 Stab Wounds, and really most of the Maggot Stomp catalog. Of course, back then the problem was the opposite. Death metal was hard to come by, especially if you did not live in a big city or somewhere with a death metal scene. There were whole years where it seemed like there was no new death metal to sate your appetite. Of course, there was death metal coming out every year, but in the 90s you didn't have Spotify curated playlists or bands creating album debut TikToks or whatever. So a lot of people just missed these albums that were coming out. However, 1991 has shown that practically none of the old heads missed the significance of that year. You probably have already gotten a glimpse of this throughout this year in the flood of 30th anniversary articles and posts about various different death metal albums, but it is worth looking at everything in sum to understand the scale of it. And then I have some theories as to why this was the year that things really exploded. So let's do a quick summary. Out of the Bay Area, cavernous death metal got its classic album, with Autopsy putting out Mental Funeral via Peaceville Records. Similarly, brutal death metal was being established by the two forefathers of the subgenre, Cannibal Corpse with their second album, but this was the first with that brutal death metal style, Butchered at Birth, and Suffocation with their debut album, Effigy of the Forgotten. Meanwhile, death grind gore innovators Carcass fully plunged into death metal with a level of songwriting on par with, though sounding different from, prog death bands like Death, with Carcass's album Necroticism descanting the Insalubrious, which I have picture vinyl of right up there. And speaking of death, that band put out their album Human in 1991 with lyrics about the twisted maze of our minds rather than their classic themes of horror and religion. On the thrashier side of the spectrum was the debut album of Malevolent Creation, The Ten Commandments, and Sepultura's Arise, probably their most influential album, because it kept one foot firmly planted in their extreme metal origins, even as they began to experiment with incorporating sounds from other genres. Though death metal experimentation in 1991 was probably most exemplified by the band Atheist with their album Unquestionable Presence. On the grindcore side of things was Assuck with their first full-length Anti-Capital, maintaining the radical left politics and micro song structures of grindcore, even while adopting the technical drumming and unorthodox song structures of death metal. But it was also a big year for the less political and more horror-focused side of grindcore, with the release of the goregrind classic Necrology by General Surgery. Even more lascivious was the second album of Pungent Stench, Been Caught Buttering, foresaging the beginning of Porno Grind by German band Gut that formed that year. Conversely, melodic death metal was getting its start with the debut LP of At the Gates, titled Gardens of Grief. But the sound we know and love as Swedish death metal, with its buzzsaw guitars and howls, was really starting to explode in 1991 with Entombed's second album, Clandestine, as well as the debut album by Dismember, Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, and the debut album by Edge of Sanity, Nothing But Death Remains. And I couldn't end this overview without giving shout-outs to two more classics that came out that year, Dawn of Possession by Immolation and War Master by Bolt Thrower, my favorite albums by both of those bands respectively. So as you can see, it was a big year in terms of the oldest death metal bands like Bolt Thrower, Carcass, Death, and Sepultura reaching new creative heights, as well as newcomers in 1991 starting new subgenres like brutal death metal and melodic death metal. This can definitely be attributed in part to simply the time needed for things to develop in the genre. Death metal started around 1983, 1984, so by 1991 you had 8 years of demos and even some studio albums establishing the foundations of the genre. Now, this isn't to say this is the inherent time progression of genres. After all, comparing this to hardcore punk, which started in 1979 and then pretty much collapsed by 1984, though of course it carried on in some places like New York and with lots of resurgences ever since. But death metal, for all its counterculture and the hysteria that caused, was far more based in typical music industry development than hardcore punk, despite death metal's origins in DIY tape trading. Within a few years, the biggest death metal bands were in the typical industry pace of one album every 1 to 2 years. Those four originators I mentioned before, Bolt Thrower, Carcass, Death, and Sepultura, all had at least 2 albums under their belt by 1991 and were all hungry for a change in their sound. Bolt Thrower and Carcass both were moving away from grindcore and getting more technically proficient. Death was changing as well, but mostly the changes at this point were thematic, showing that death metal could be about more than just gore and blasphemy. And Sepultura was beginning their journey of connecting not just with other genres like hardcore, but also with the roots of indigenous music in their native Brazil. But I'm a Marxist. I think human development in broad terms is generally motivated by political economy, and death metal is no exception. Just like the brief explosion of hardcore punk can be explained as the backlash to the false promise of the Reagan Revolution, and then wound up no longer being necessary once you had the second Reagan recession rolling around and everyone realized it was bullshit. Death metal's golden year of 1991 was a product of economic and political forces. Major labels began to realize around 1990 the profit potential of death metal. For all of its edginess in terms of album covers and lyrics, brutal death metal was not born out of the underground, but rather born out of the most mainstream of music production. Suffocation's debut was put out by Roadrunner, a label that literally started as essentially a European metal importer and now is owned by Warner Music. And while Cannibal Corpse's Butchered at Birth may be able to claim it was put out by an independent label, the legendary Metal Blade Records, it was distributed by none other than Warner Music. As I always say, and with all due respect to the independent labels out there on their grind, like Metal Blade and Relapse and so forth, extreme metal is just as ingrained in the capitalist economy as pop music. So in very plain terms, there were so many great death metal albums in 1991 because the capital was there to make them. And it was especially going to More Sound Studios in Florida, which went from recording a couple of death metal albums in the 1980s to recording 7 in 1991 alone, most of which I've already mentioned. Now, before you start having a "you lied to me, Barney Greenway, you actually love capitalism" moment, I actually think there is something of a contradiction here, and it's more complicated. Because while the economic forces that made death metal's golden year possible can't be ignored, the inspiration for the band seems to be a reflection of the politics at the time. 1991 was the year of the great neoliberal turn internationally that had already taken place in the US and the UK domestically, particularly with the Soviet Union and India. It was the beginning of a new kind of imperialism as well, demonstrated by the First Persian Gulf War, beginning the still ongoing attempts to this day by the United States to suppress dissent in the Middle East, to capitalism, to neocolonialism, and to Christian supremacy. The political theorist Francis Fukuyama was in the process of writing his book, The End of History and the Last Man, which would be released the following year in 1992, that argued that Western liberal democracy had essentially won and was the final point of evolution in human history. That may seem laughable to us today, but it was a very sincerely believed view and one propagandized by corporate media as well as politicians like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. That end of history politically was also treated as an end of history culturally. The music would be all bland, neatly packaged pop music, as enforced by the PMRC and corporate media. It was Christian supremacy about social mores, from drug use to female masturbation, under the guise of some kind of secular American values. And death metal called out that bullshit alongside other counterculture genres like gangster rap. Remember when gangster rap was countercultural? This calling out was most blatantly done by songs like No Forgiveness Without Bloodshed by Immolation, where they sang rules of their existence, insane immortal laws, desires are forbidden, lusting for their flesh. But it was also done more indirectly by the turn to gore by many death metal bands during this year, though none, of course, as masterfully as the Godfather's Carcass. As Jeff Walker stated in a recent interview with Decibel magazine about the album's 30th anniversary, I toiled over the lyrics on necroticism. I spent a long time tweaking them. I took that part of my role seriously. The lyrics were never targeted at anybody. We wrote what we were interested in. They had a limited appeal as a result. They're so niche. Pop music lyrics are lowest common denominator, and my lyrics are not. That was deliberate. There are only so many words in everyday use. We were trying to do something different. I was always looking for better adjectives to words I've used 100 times. In other words, Carcass's lyrics were like the opposite of the kind of copy you'd see in corporate marketing as well as pop music, a rebellion against this kind of universalism through dumbing everything down. Not only were musicians like Jeff Walker sick of this neoliberal end of history, fake, bland corporate dystopia, music fans were as well. Unfortunately, things were only going to get much worse in all of these respects after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. For better or for worse, that doubling down of Christian supremacy and imperialistic single-mindedness created another major wave of metal music, but that's a story for another video. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. I've got videos in the works for a tier list of the discography of psychedelic sludge metal titans Kylesa and a dive into the subgenre of doom metal. And then I'll have a series of videos coming out on my top 50 metal albums of 2021. Holy shit, it has been such a good year for metal. arguably as good as 1991, so you'll want to watch those.